85%. That is the share of every significant earthquake ever recorded in the Texas Panhandle that has arrived in the last 6 years. Not in California, not in Alaska, not in the Permian Basin oil fields to the south, but in the flat, wind-scoured cattle country between Amarillo and the Oklahoma line. At 5:21 in the morning on July 23rd. The ground under Roberts County released a magnitude 5.0 earthquake, the strongest instrumentally recorded event in this region since at least 1900, and only the fourth to cross magnitude 4.0 in 126 years. It was felt across 3 states and 200 miles from the epicenter. Nobody was hurt. No structural damage was confirmed. The obvious read is that nothing happened. That is not the story. The county sitting directly on top of the epicenter has no earthquake section in its emergency operations protocol. It has plans for fire. It has plans for tornado. It has plans for flood. It has nothing for the hazard that just occurred beneath its feet. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why the ground under the Texas Panhandle started shaking 6 years ago, and what to. 26 billion barrels of wastewater pumped into basement rock has to do with it. 1,926. That is the number of active underground injection control wells operating across the Texas Panhandle, each one a steel-lined shaft designed to take fluid that came up with oil and gas production and push it back into the ground under pressure. Through those wells, over a documented 35-year window, 2,026 billion barrels of wastewater were injected into 34 different geologic formations beneath the Panhandle surface. 87% of that volume, 1,096 billion barrels, was concentrated into just 7 of those formations, and one of the 7 is the Precambrian basement rock, the oldest, deepest crust in the region. That is the proof layer beneath the 85% figure. Peer-reviewed research published in the AAPG Bulletin by University of Texas at Austin scientists found that 61% of Panhandle earthquakes examined in the study showed minimal or stronger evidence of being induced. That classification means the shaking correlated in time, location, or depth with underground injection or oil and gas activity rather than with a natural tectonic cycle. The rate of earthquakes tripled between 2 study windows, from 1.21 per year between 1983 and 2007, up to 3.50 per year between 2008 and 2018. And that was the academic data. The post-2020 surge is steeper still. Induced seismicity is the technical name for this. Earthquakes caused or made more likely by human activity beneath the surface. In plain language, water forced underground under pressure can migrate along fractures, reach fault surfaces that have been locked for hundreds of millions of years, and change the balance of forces holding those faults still. The water does not create the earthquake. It permits one that was already waiting. The pattern is not new. It has been migrating. Oklahoma went through the same escalation curve first, when disposal volume surged and its earthquake rate rose from a handful per year to hundreds. The Permian Basin, directly south of the Panhandle, went through it next, and it is still going through it. The Panhandle is the newest front in a wave of induced seismicity that has moved across the southern mid-continent for more than a decade, following the wastewater rather than the drilling. And the consequences of that wave are not hypothetical. On February 14, 2025, a magnitude 5.0 earthquake struck the Permian Basin, and by that evening, a gas pipeline had ruptured near the epicenter, with the resulting fire not extinguished until the following morning. Same state. Same magnitude. 17 months ago. That is the ground this earthquake landed on. The question is what happened at 5:21 in the morning on July 23rd, and how far the shaking actually reached. The communities nearest the epicenter are not suburbs. They are small, widely spaced towns connected by 2-lane highways served by volunteer fire departments and anchored to an economy built almost entirely on cattle, wheat, and oil and gas production. Spearman, the nearest named town at 24 miles from the epicenter, has a population of roughly 3,300. Pampa, 17 miles away, has about 17,000 residents and is the largest population center in the immediate felt zone. Borger sits 40 miles to the west with roughly 12,000 people. These are communities where a single pipeline rupture or a single bridge failure does not produce a detour. It eliminates the only route available. The infrastructure connecting them was designed for a region that did not shake. At 5:21 a.m. Central Daylight Time, 10:21 Universal Time, on July 23, 2026, a magnitude 5.0 earthquake initiated 3.5 miles beneath Roberts County, Texas, 24 miles south-southeast of Spearman, and 24 miles northwest of Miami, a town of roughly 550 people. The rupture was shallow. The motion, per waveform analysis, was primarily strike-slip, meaning the two sides of the fault slid horizontally past each other, side to side, rather than one riding up over the other. The shaking radiated outward across the flat country of the southern high plains. In Pampa, 17 miles from the epicenter, residents reported the ground moving for up to 30 seconds. In White Deer, people described being thrown off balance while standing. In Mubiti, pictures came off the walls and items fell from shelves. In Amarillo, 60 miles southwest of the epicenter, the shaking was clearly felt across the city. The felt zone expanded rapidly outward, north into the Oklahoma Panhandle, east into central Oklahoma, and northeast into southern Kansas. Then it reached further than a Panhandle earthquake had any recent right to reach. Reports came in from Oklahoma City, 250 miles away, from Tulsa, from Lawton, from Wichita and Dodge City in Kansas, from Kinsley, Kansas, 200 miles from the epicenter and 40 miles east of Dodge City, where residents still felt a distinct rumble. Reports arrived from parts of New Mexico. The United States Geological Survey received hundreds of "Did you feel it?" submissions within the first hours, mapping a felt footprint that crossed 3 state lines. The immediate response was mechanical and fast. Texas Department of Public Safety officers and Texas Department of Transportation crews inspected highways and bridges near the epicenter and reported no damage to roadways. Pipeline companies operating in the region activated their internal earthquake protocols, automated systems that flag any seismic event above a threshold magnitude, and trigger pressure checks along nearby pipeline segments. In the hours after the earthquake, those pressure checks were running across Roberts, Hansford, and neighboring counties. The Roberts County Sheriff asked about his primary concern, named pipeline integrity first. A neighboring county holds a dam over what is currently a dry lake. Local officials could not assess the dam's structural integrity in a live load condition because the reservoir behind it is empty. There is no water pressing against it to test the seal. The dam remains an unknown, and no protocol exists to inspect one in that state after seismic loading. No injuries were reported. No confirmed structural damage was identified by authorities. There were unconfirmed reports of cracked drywall in homes nearest the epicenter, but nothing verified. USC's modeling estimated the economic loss from the event as minimal. A magnitude 5.0 sits at the boundary between what seismologists classify as a moderate earthquake and what the built environment can typically absorb without visible consequences. On the standard magnitude scale, it releases roughly 30 times more energy than a magnitude 4.0 and about 1,000 times less than a magnitude 6.0. In regions with modern building codes designed for seismic loading, a 5. 0 at 3.5 miles depth is unlikely to produce structural failures. In regions without seismic design standards, the margin is thinner. The Texas Panhandle has no statewide seismic building code, and the structures nearest this epicenter, residential homes, barns, pipeline junctions, and small-town infrastructure, were built for wind and weather, not for ground acceleration. This event did not cause confirmed damage. A magnitude 5.5 at the same depth and the same location, on the same undesigned structures, is a different conversation. The same day carried a second event, unrelated but notable. At 1:15 p.m. Central Daylight Time, about 8 hours after the Panhandle earthquake, a magnitude 3. 9 struck near Westbrook in central Texas, deep inside the Permian Basin, a different fault system, a different mechanism, a different geological setting. The two events are not connected. But 2 earthquakes of magnitude 3.9 and 5.0 in Texas on the same calendar day is a data point worth logging. USG's aftershock forecasting for the Roberts County event assigned a 52% probability of a magnitude 3. 0 aftershock in the days following the main shock. The forecast assigned a 20% probability, 1 in 5, of an aftershock reaching magnitude 4.0 or greater. Aftershock sequences at this magnitude can continue for days, and in some cases weeks. The forecast is still open. The data tells you what happened and where it reached. It does not tell you what is underneath Roberts County that made a 5. 0 possible in a region that had never recorded one before. Here is the part of the Texas Panhandle that nobody sees because it is buried under 3 miles of rock. Running east to west beneath the surface, cutting across the Panhandle like a suture line under skin, is a structure called the Amarillo-Wichita Uplift. It is a failed rift, a place where, approximately 500 million years ago in the early Cambrian period, the North American crust began to pull itself apart and then stopped. The split never completed. The pulling stopped, the crust settled, and the deep fractures created by the attempt were left in place, buried under 500 million years of sediment. The uplift is the scar of a continent that tried to divide and did not finish. The scar never healed. Beneath the Amarillo-Wichita uplift lie basement-rooted faults, fractures that reach down into the Precambrian basement, the oldest and deepest rock in the region, formed before complex life existed on Earth. The exact geometry of these faults is not fully mapped. What is known is that they exist, that they extend into the deepest crust, and that they have carried tectonic stress for roughly 500 million years. When earthquake epicenters in the Panhandle are plotted on a map, they concentrate along an east-west band between 35.25 and 36.25 degrees north, a band that sits directly over the uplift and its fault system. That is where the ground is moving. To understand how a well drilled in 2015 can cause a fault to slip in 2026. Start from first principles. A fault is a fracture in rock where 2 sides are pressed together. The friction between those 2 surfaces is what holds them in place. Tectonic stress, the slow, constant force of continental motion, is always trying to move them, and the friction is always holding them still. As long as the friction is stronger than the stress, the fault does not slip. When the stress exceeds the friction, it does. Wastewater injection does not add stress to the fault. It reduces the friction. Imagine a heavy bookshelf leaning against a wall. It has been leaning there for years. Its full weight is against the wall, and the floor is pressing back on its base. The friction between the base of the shelf and the floor is what has kept it still. Now imagine slowly, over months, pouring oil under the base of the bookshelf. The oil does not push the shelf. The oil does not add weight to the shelf. What the oil does is remove the thing that was holding the shelf still. One morning, the shelf slides on its own. When it does, the cause is not the weight of the books. The cause is the removal of the resistance. That is what fluid does to a locked fault. Water injected under pressure migrates along existing fractures in the rock. When that fluid reaches the surface of a fault, the pressure of the fluid pushes back against the rock walls of the fault, reducing the normal force that had been holding the 2 sides pressed together. Reduce that force, and you reduce the friction. Reduce the friction below the level of the tectonic stress that was always trying to move the fault, and the fault slips. The slip is the earthquake. And this is the part most people never hear explained. The general public associates fracking with induced earthquakes. In the physical mechanism, this is usually wrong. Hydraulic fracturing itself, the process of pumping fluid into a well at high pressure to fracture shale for oil and gas production, typically operates for hours to days per well and generates tremors that rarely exceed magnitude 3.0. The events of concern, the ones that reach magnitude 4.0 and magnitude 5.0, are almost always associated with wastewater disposal. The injection of the produced water that comes up with the oil pumped into deep disposal wells at high volumes, month after month, year after year. The drilling is not the trigger. The disposal is. Depth is the second variable. This earthquake occurred at 3.5 miles below the surface. The Precambrian basement in this region begins at comparable depth. Wastewater injected into or near basement rock does not create new faults. What it does is pressurize old ones, faults that were already loaded with 500 million years of tectonic stress, waiting only for a change in the friction balance to release. The injection does not cause tectonic stress. It permits stress that was already there to be released as an earthquake, at a time and place determined by where the fluid front reached the fault. The formal cause of this specific event has not been determined. It may be a natural reactivation of the Amarillo-Wichita uplift faults, driven purely by tectonic loading that finally exceeded the local friction. It may be induced, triggered by the migration of injected fluid to a critically stressed fault surface. It may be a combination, in which decades of tectonic stress were finalized into a rupture by a small addition of pore pressure, the fluid pressure building inside the rock's natural spaces from injection activity. The scientific investigation to separate those possibilities takes months, and the results are often probabilistic rather than definitive. The ambiguity is itself the finding. 2. 26 billion barrels of fluid have been pumped into the rock sitting on top of a half-billion-year-old failed rift. The earthquake rate in the region has nearly tripled, and the analysis to determine which specific events came from which specific cause remains ongoing. The ground did not break. The grip holding it still was removed. 900 people. That is the approximate population of Roberts County, Texas, the county sitting directly over the epicenter of the strongest instrumentally recorded earthquake in the Panhandle in over a century. Its emergency management coordinator asked what the county's earthquake protocol looked like, confirmed that the county's emergency operations plan contained sections for fire, for tornado, and for flooding. It contains no section for earthquake. The plan for the hazard that just occurred does not exist in the county's own operating document. The gap is not an oversight from a distant past. 85% of all recorded magnitude 2.5 or greater earthquakes in the Texas Panhandle have occurred since 2020. The ground in this region began shaking in earnest 6 years ago. During those 6 years, the county at the current epicenter did not add an earthquake procedure to its plan. Neither did the surrounding Panhandle counties. When the coordinator was asked what a Roberts County resident should do if a stronger aftershock arrived tomorrow, no procedure could be named, because no procedure has been written. The private sector operating in the same territory did not wait. Within minutes of the main shock, the initial and largest rupture in the sequence. The pipeline companies with infrastructure crossing Roberts and Hansford counties activated their own earthquake protocols. Automated seismic monitoring flagged the event. Pressure checks began along nearby pipeline segments. Crews were dispatched. Those companies have plans for a magnitude 5.0 earthquake in this region because their engineering risk models require them to have plans. The counties beneath the same pipelines do not. A neighboring county holds a dam over a dry reservoir. There is no water in the lake behind it. When officials attempted to check the dam for earthquake-induced stress, they found there is no protocol for inspecting a dam whose reservoir is empty at the time of seismic loading, the accumulated stress placed on a structure by ground shaking, and no clear guidance on what to look for in a structure that is not carrying its normal load. The gap is not just missing pages in a binder. It is missing frameworks for the specific structures that exist in the region. The historical proof of what this gap can produce is 17 months old. On February 14, 2025, a magnitude 5.0 earthquake struck the Permian Basin, 400 miles south of Roberts County. That same evening, a natural gas pipeline near the epicenter ruptured. A fire followed. Emergency crews worked overnight and extinguished the fire by the next morning. The pipeline operator had an earthquake protocol. The pipeline still failed. The counties surrounding it did not have earthquake plans at the county level, and the response depended on whichever agencies happened to have the capacity to arrive. The pattern that played out in the Permian Basin is instructive because it did not stop at one pipeline failure. In the 5 years before that February 2025 rupture, West Texas had recorded 2 prior pipeline failures within 300 yards of each other, separated by 12 months in the same seismic restriction area. Those earlier ruptures were not triggered by a single large earthquake, but by the cumulative stress of repeated smaller events on aging infrastructure that was never rated for seismic cycling. The question for the Panhandle is not only whether a single large earthquake can rupture a line, but whether the tripling of the background earthquake rate is slowly fatiguing infrastructure that was designed for 0 seismic events per year. Same state, same magnitude, and the failure mode was infrastructure, the exact category the Roberts County Sheriff named first as his post-event concern. The engineering exposure extends beyond pipelines. A published engineering study examining Texas highway bridges in induced seismicity zones found that those structures were designed without incorporating seismic demand, the forces an earthquake would impose on the structure, into their load calculations. Bridges in the Panhandle were engineered against wind, against traffic load. against thermal expansion, against flood scour. Seismic shaking was not among the design cases considered, because at the time those bridges were designed, this region was not a seismic zone. The 61% peer-reviewed finding that a majority of Panhandle earthquakes showed evidence of being induced describes a region that is now generating earthquakes through industrial activity, in a built environment that was engineered for a region that was not. The earthquakes arrived. The emergency plans did not. The fact that 85% of the Panhandle's significant seismicity has concentrated into 6 years means the aftershock data, the injection volume records, and the state regulatory response will tell us whether this event was a peak or a step on the way to something larger. 3 signals are worth tracking. Watch the US-GS aftershock page for the Roberts County event. A 52% probability of a magnitude 3.0 aftershock means follow-up shaking is more likely than not, and the 20% probability of a magnitude 4.0 or greater aftershock would produce a second felt event across the same 3-state footprint. Watch the Texas Railroad Commission's seismicity response page for new injection well restrictions, permit modifications, or shut-in orders in the Panhandle counties surrounding the epicenter. Because if restrictions appear in the coming weeks, that is the signal that state regulators believe induced seismicity is a contributing factor to this event. Watch for pipeline integrity reports from operators in Roberts, Hansford, and the counties immediately adjacent. Since the February 2025 Permian Basin pipeline rupture established that infrastructure failure following a magnitude 5.0 in this state is not a hypothetical outcome. The common reading of this event is that a magnitude 5.0 with no injuries and no confirmed damage means nothing serious happened. That reading confuses one day's outcome with a regional trajectory for magnitude 4. 0 or greater earthquakes in 126 years, and 85% of all notable seismicity arriving in just 6 of those years, is not a single event, it is a change in the seismic identity of the region. The real question is not whether this earthquake caused damage today, but whether the next one will be larger, and whether any county in the Panhandle will be ready when it arrives. We will be tracking the aftershock sequence, the state regulatory response, and any pipeline integrity findings from the Roberts County epicenter zone.